So this poem by Shelley is a really lovely little poem, I think. It's kind of sad, but also beautiful and also really kind of interesting exploration of the internal psyche and then the external world and how we relate to those things around us through the way that we feel, through our emotions. So the title, Stanzas Written in Dejection near Naples, is almost like journalistic. It's like a diary entry. So he's near Naples in Italy, and he's writing some little lines about what he sees about the landscape. But his state is unusual. He's dejected, meaning he's kind of depressed. He's maybe a bit disappointed, feeling a bit down, that kind of thing. So what I find really interesting about this poem is that Naples in Italy is, beautiful. I was actually about half a year ago, I was in Naples and I was looking out over the Bay of Naples, which is exactly where Shelley is, what he's doing in this poem. And it is a really beautiful scene. And it was the middle of summer and the sun was shining. It would be almost impossible to feel really down if you're on holiday looking out at that scenery. But Shelley, who at the time of writing this is doing a trip around Italy, he's very confused about his mood and how much his mood is affecting the way that he views the world. So we'll have a look a bit more deeply at that once we've read the poem, but it's a really interesting disjuncture, I guess is the word, or like a kind of contrast between his mood and then the outer world around him. So it's reasonably long. There should actually be some vocab here. Yeah, so just really quickly kind of pause and write down any vocab that you need, just to sort of help you with the comprehension of the poem. And then I'll go back to the poem itself. So I want you to just pause here and read the poem aloud. And I want you to, if possible, use two colours or two ways of highlighting. So the first one is looking for imagery that relates to the outside world that he sees. So looking at the landscape of Naples. You might even look up some images of the Bay of Naples and just look at what it looks like yourself. It's not really one of those things that ever changes. So even though Shelley's writing hundreds of years ago, it does look pretty similar to how I saw it, a few months ago, how you'd find it in a picture now. So yeah, one color or one way of highlighting or underlining for the landscape, and then the second way for Shelley himself and his opinions or his kind of mood, his feeling as the poem goes on. So yeah, just read the poem aloud to yourself, work on underlining those things. Don't worry if you don't get it perfectly right. And then come back to the lesson when you're ready. You might notice it really starts with the beauty of the landscape. How amazing Naples looks. Warm sun, clear sky, waves, snowy mountains in the distance that look purple. So there's a lot of visual imagery, rich visual imagery. The different sounds of the day are like separate notes that turn into a single voice of joy. So the external world, nature itself, is beautiful and full of life. And he looks down at the sea, and the sea is deep. It's green and purple. There's waves. And he sits alone on a sandy beach. And there's sounds coming up from the sea. And it sounds lovely, it sounds sweet. And he says, I wonder if anyone else feels like me at this moment. So we assume, in the first two stanzas at least, that he's having a good time and that he's feeling quite well. But it's a bit strange when he says, I'm alone, and he says that he wonders if anybody else feels like this. But we think maybe he feels joyful. Stanza 3, which is kind of here with alas, this is your volta, your turning point. He doesn't have any hope. He's not healthy. He doesn't have any, he's kind of in a state of sickness. He's not peaceful or calm. He doesn't have any fame or power or love or leisure, which means kind of fun, like things that he enjoys. He sees everyone else smiling, and they call life a pleasure. But the hand that he's been dealt, or the cup that he's been dealt, is different. He doesn't see his cup as half full, maybe we would say. So he's in an extremely depressive state of mind, despite the beauty of the landscape around him, and despite the fact that he knows loads of other people actually feel similar too. They all, they all feel similar as each other and different from him. So there's lots of people enjoying themselves in Naples, and he can't relate to them. And he says, even though, even now despair is mild, so he feels a little, what we call apathetic. He feels a bit numb. It's not like he's really, really, crying and overly emotional. He just feels kind of quite deadened, similar to how people, feel when they're depressed. He's like a tired child, and he's weeping away his life that he has to bear and he has borne. So it's suggesting those words born and bear, they're both the same verb, and they suggest that life is continual kind of burden for him. It's a continual state of suffering. And he's waiting for death because it might steal over him like sleep. And he might feel in the warm air his cheek grow cold and hear the sea breathe over his dying brain its last monotony. Monotony is something that's kind of repetitive and boring. So it's sort of like repeating cycles of the sea sound sort of repetitive and boring to him. And then he's thinking finally in the last stanza about, other people. Some people might actually care that he was cold, that he was dead. And when this nice day is gone, and his lost heart, which is too old too quickly, insults that day with this untimely, meaning like inappropriate grumbling. So he knows that it's really not appropriate, this kind of mood, if you're like in the south of Italy, and it's a warm sunny day and it's a really great world around you. It's inappropriate to feel this depressed, but he still feels that way anyway. So he feels like, some people might feel bad that I'm dead. I'm someone that men don't love, but they still regret. Maybe regret talking to him, something like this. Unlike this day, which, when the sun sets on its stainless glory, carries on, and it's kind of still enjoyed, like joy in memory. So he's thinking about legacy, really, in the final stanza. There's a translation of it here for you, stanza 5 on the left. It's a quite difficult logic there, but it sort of makes sense. So he's thinking about his own death, whether people will care that he dies, whether he'll live on in the memory of people. He's also feeling unworthy because he knows it's a beautiful day and he's grumbling and moaning about it, and he can't really relate to it. And then also he knows that people will remember this day beautifully, and it will be kind of a joyful memory for them. And he's wondering if he would be like that to people or not, whether they would remember him joyfully, whether the thought of him would make them happy. And something interesting about memory is that it lasts longer than the brief moment itself. So, it's only a 24-hour period this day, but in people's memory it would last forever. So it's an interesting sort of meditation on the way that time works, really, as well. So, kind of depressive poem, but also quite complex poem that juxtaposes external kind of beauty and life and joy with internal turmoil, suffering, depression. There's a huge kind of spectrum of feelings and moods and tones and emotions. And Yeah, I mean, I've personally had this type of feeling before, and it's really, I find it quite comforting and interesting that someone's explored it in a poem, because I remember really struggling with it at the time. Like, I went on holiday with a group of my absolute best friends, and we all went to Wales. And we stayed in my friend's cottage that his family owns, and it was really sunny and just beautiful. And we went on walks, and we went swimming in a mountain lake, and we cooked really nice food, and we sung songs. We did pretty much everything that you do for kind of a perfect trip away with your friends. And then the whole time I was just feeling kind of out of it, not really in a happy mood, and I couldn't really enjoy myself to the same extent that everyone else was having fun. And I felt a bit like a loner and a bit kind of separate from everyone. And I also felt like I wasn't taking advantage of the time there, and I felt a bit kind of rubbish about the fact that, it was meant to be perfect and amazing, and something about my own head made me feel a bit down and a bit kind of disconnected from the landscape and disconnected from the joy of my friends. So I imagine Shelley's feeling similar, and I've definitely felt that way before. So if you have felt that way, I want you to just take a minute now. You can pause and just write down a few notes about a moment when you felt differently from everyone around you, or you felt like you weren't taking advantage of a really good opportunity and it made you feel kind of bad about yourself because there was something amazing, that you were meant to be experiencing, or a really great thing that happened to you, but you couldn't quite, connect with the excitement of that moment. So you just want to write a couple of notes on that. I think most people have something like that at some point. If you don't have anything, it's okay. You don't have to do the task. But try and think of a time when you've been emotionally slightly out of touch with the world around you in some way. Yeah, and just write a few short notes, like a little story about what you were doing and how you felt and how the world was versus how you were. It might be the other way around as well. Maybe there's a moment where you felt really happy and joyful and everyone else was down or gloomy. So you can have it the other way around as well. So yeah, once you've kind of looked at that, we'll go more into the analysis. So it's an anecdotal poem. It's telling a story about a personal moment and trying to capture a real life experience. So we think it's Shelley himself who's sitting and staring out to sea in the Bay of Naples. So he's looking at the sea and where it meets the land and the beach. And he's thinking about the beauty of his surroundings and the illogical depression that he has internally. And then he sort of does think that when I look back at this moment, I'll remember how beautiful the day was. So he is sort of aware by the end that those emotions pass and then the memory remains. And when I think of my trip to Wales with my friends now, I completely feel happy and think of all the amazing times that we had. And every time I talk to them about it, we're always all so happy about it. I don't feel sad anymore. So Shelley's right that, when you look back on a memory like that, you do actually remember the good bits as well. You can think back to your own memory if you wrote one down. How do you remember that now? Is it different from how you felt at the time? So this is a picture of the Bay of Naples. This is kind of more what it looked like in Shelley's time. It's quite built up now compared to this, but it does roughly sort of look the same. I think from memory that you can see Vesuvius there as well. There's quite a lot of mountains around. It's very, very beautiful. Temperature is very warm. And yeah, it's just southern Italy's stunning. So yeah, he's very lucky that he got to visit it, I think. So technique-wise, there's a lot of techniques. I'm not going to go too detailed into them just because of time pressure. But the main thing I think to start with is just to look at imagery and make sure that you're aware of all the images which you should have circled at the beginning of the lesson. And then think about the first person and the use of when he's talking about himself versus when he's describing the landscape and the shift between them. This is another one, little bit later, still the Bay of Naples looking out. So you can see kind of mountains in the distance. People having a nice time with the sea. So yeah, there's a little bit of context about Naples and the Bay of Naples. I think one of the craziest stories is about Emperor Caligula. So Caligula is a Roman emperor, and he's known for being pretty mad and doing quite mental things. So if you're interested in history, you can look him up generally because he's a really strange guy. But one thing he did was he built a 3-mile long bridge of boats across the bay. So from one side to the other, it's a really, really big bay. It spans the whole of Naples as a city. And rode across them in a chariot, wearing the golden breastplate of Alexander the Great. And I think it was to prove his power or his greatness or something, that he could even ride a horse on water, or so I can't quite remember the story, but it's definitely to sort of try and prove something really insane that makes no sense. So Shelley is obviously aware of all this stuff. He's very classically trained, so he's maybe thinking about, the history of the Bay of Naples and the amount of greatness that happened there versus how sort of deflated and disappointed he's feeling himself. So Shelley is one of the most famous Romantic poets. And there's a little bit of a description of Romanticism here, so make sure that you know what Romantic poetry is and what the main themes and ideas of Romantic literature are, because they're probably the best context point that you could use in a poem like this to analyse Romanticism and then how Shelley is using Romanticism in the poem. So there's quite a bit of detail here about it, but I do recommend researching that further and just getting to a point where you're super confident on what Romantic poetry is and what the rules of Romantic poetry are, so that you can compare and contrast what traditional Romantic poets do with how Shelley is using that genre here. So yeah, a couple of things that I think are really interesting to do with Romanticism. One is that it focuses on the kind of beauty and power of nature. So something kind of eternal about how beautiful that day is. It's so wonderful that he's sure it will last not only in his own memory, but everyone's memory. And he, as a human, seems so weak and insignificant compared to that. I think he feels inadequate compared to the beauty of the day. Another one is that Romanticism actually is sort of a counter movement to the standard beliefs of the time. So at the time, people felt like being really strongly emotional was a sign of primitivism, that you were kind of more wild or savage, you were less civilized if you embraced your emotions. So most people in society tried to be very sort of repressed, really. They wouldn't show strong positive or negative emotions. They tried to be really in control of their feelings, which suited some people fine, but other people had a serious issue with repressing intense emotions, especially obviously creative people like Shelley. So Romantic poets thought that all of your emotions are kind of a blessing, even the really negative ones or the really dark ones. All your moods are valid and they're worthy of talking about and of embracing and of feeling fully to the fullest. So as a Romantic poet, you can kind of understand Shelley's poem in a different way, because if we just kind of read it as a normal poem, it seems quite depressive. But if he's a Romantic poet, he's maybe genuinely trying to lean into that feeling of sadness and trying to explore that more, because he feels that it's a worthy subject for his poetry. So he's not complaining so much as he is exploring a dark or difficult mood that he's placed into. So that's maybe one of the more interesting things you could say about Romanticism and the poem. So there's a little bit more as well on Shelley here. It's a fascinating guy. I really love him. He's one of my favourite poets ever. So yeah, kind of went to town on the context here. But yeah, there's some sort of interesting things about, a lot of romantic poets see nature as God's sort of an expression of God's presence on earth, and they think that nature is created by God. Or if you observe nature, you can observe the workings of God. Shelley's a bit more difficult because he's more atheistic. So he doesn't quite see it that way, but you can still see him as, interested in the power of nature versus the relative weakness of humans. If you know one of his most famous poems, Ozymandias, this is completely about that theme as well, the fact that humans are very weak and we only live for a very short period of time. We're not really capable of making anything that great or that lasting, versus nature is kind of eternal, all-powerful. So you can see that here as well, where he's thinking about how amazing the Bay of Naples is. And at the beginning of the lesson, I was saying, I went and saw it a few months ago and it looks like how it looked when Shelley was there. But obviously Shelley passed away a long time ago and he's no longer around. So he is kind of right about how strong the effects of nature are versus how weak humans are in comparison. If you're interested in him, look up how he dies. It's really mad, really, really crazy. So I want you to just pick a couple of these themes here and try and explore them in relation to the poem. So use some quotations and analyze the quotes in detail. Try and understand what is the actual message about them. So he's talking about time, but what is the message about time? He's talking about nature, but what are his opinions on nature? So if you can get to that point, it gives you really good preparation for essays. And this is a creative task, but I do really recommend doing it. So it's basically getting you used to the idea of sensory imagery, mood and atmosphere. So it kind of trains your brain to understand that a lot more in poetry. So even if you don't see yourself as a creative person, this will make you a lot better at analysing poetry. So it's really worth doing this task. There's just a little observational exercise where you sit somewhere where you can see nature. If you're at home, you can just literally look out your window, or you can go somewhere that's very natural that you like, and just spend around 15 minutes writing what you see using poetic imagery. So instead of just describing it in a basic way, try and be creative and poetic, use interesting vocabulary. You might use some techniques as well there. If you want, and if you're confident, you can turn that into a poem and try and write a poem about the thing that you see. So once you've done that, you can also try these essay questions. And the middle one is the hardest one. So if you want a really tough one, try that one. If you want an easier one, try the first or third one there. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this lesson. You found it interesting, and hopefully you found the poem quite thought-provoking, and and you feel quite confident with analysing the sort of double nature of it now as well. So yeah, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you guys soon in a future lesson.